Dr. Jordan, welcome to the podcast. I'm so excited to have you here.
Oh, thank you so much, Shyamala. I'm so excited to be here.
Amazing. So I'm going to jump right in. And I always like to start with just having you tell our audience, who you are and what you do.
Sure. So I'm a naturopathic doctor. Although I think like the real part of my story starts before I became a naturopathic doctor. My background in at school was actually in a concept called critical appraisal. So my degree was in this idea called critical appraisal, which is basically evaluating medical research to decide what's real, what isn't real, and then how we should change what we do with patients based on that. And then I went and became a naturopath. And I can imagine that that sounds like an ironic career choice, right? Because I think when we think about integrative or naturopathic care, we don't always imagine like the science or the rigor that we would see maybe with conventional medicine. However, when we talk about women's health and we talk about hormonal health, the research on women's health and hormonal health is actually rooted in an integrative approach. And so this was a natural fit for me to be interested in women's health and a naturopathic approach to it, because that's actually what the best evidence is for how we should be supporting patients. And so I became a naturopathic doctor. I have focused on women's health. And I will say, like, it's interesting, the things that I have focused on in my career are really a reflection of where I am at in my own life and my own journey, which I think is really common. I wrote Caring to Term after struggling with my own infertility, my own 3 miscarriages. And once I had successfully had my 2 kids and started to suffer with debilitating PMS and PMDD, did I transition all of my research towards like what on earth was happening in my own body when it came to my hormones. And that's where I came to this place of being, so deeply interested in how to support women's hormonal health, specifically looking at the mood changes that women have with PMS, perimenopause, and then eventually transitioning into menopause. I'm starting to pre-study for what my life and world will be like then.
We'll need to have you back for sure.
That's right. We'll come back in like 5 years when I'm like menopausal. I will come back.
I'll be right there with you.
So that's where I kind of have got to this place where my goal is really to create a bridge between what we know in the research and then the other, like the woman out in the wild, right, who doesn't have access to that information. Or we typically in the past have made your doctor this gateway where you could get high quality information about your health. Women actually deserve to have that information at their fingertips. I think we do better for women and women's health if we can help them learn how to advocate for themselves in their own health. We typically don't do a great job in women's health, especially in Canada. And so I want women to have access to that information. So that has been what my personal passion project over the last 15 years is, how do we get what we know in the research into the hands of every woman so that she can show up better in her life and her health and then move the whole thing forward, meaning the whole world forward.
This is amazing. And truly, we have known each other for some time. I've really gotten to know your work, I would say, through our relationship, right? Through our friendship and just really getting to know sort of what you do in the world. And I think one of the things, Jordan, that has always struck me about you is your ability to take the research, to take the evidence, to take, the science behind what you do and to make it super, super practical. And I know near the end of our time together, we'll talk about where people can find you, but I mean, I need to say it right now because I always say this every single time. You've been in my Facebook group. We've done an interview in there. Is if you guys are hanging out on Instagram, I have to tell you that Dr. Jordan Robertson's Instagram account is quite literally one of my absolute favorite resources because you have this, and I joke with you about this, but you post memes all the time, right? I think you're known for your memes on your Instagram account, but the beauty of the way that you use that vehicle to really speak to women and women's health is you always tie it back to something that is so relevant and so eye-opening and just such practical topics. And that's one of the things I've truly come to love and respect about you, right? As a practitioner, you bring us such accessible information that is like truly rooted in the research and in the evidence. So I'm so excited for our conversation.
Me too. Yeah, let's dive in.
Let's dive in. So, I want to start with we're going to talk today about PMS. We're going to talk about hormones. We're going to talk about relationships. Can you start by telling us a little bit about the strain that PMS can actually place on relationships?
Sure. So I'm going to take it like I'm going to back up for 1 second to talk a little bit about what that PMS sort of experience actually is. So for women who are cycling, or for people who are cycling with estrogen and progesterone and ovulating mid-month. So this is not people who are on the pill. This is not people who are not ovulating, right? So to have PMS, you have to be ovulating. That we have these distinct phases in our cycle, right? So right after your period, there is this like sort of quiet, nice time, and that is the follicular phase. So early in that month, and it's typically the first half of the month, hormone levels are low-ish. They're supposed to be low. That's generally where women will report that they feel their best, right? So sort of from, if you're counting your day one is the first day of real menstrual flow, women typically feel their best sort of starting around day 3 and maybe up until day 14, or that day of ovulation. And that time women feel confident, they feel like it's easy to communicate. Conflict is generally pretty low. Women can run on less sleep, less fuel. They're more resilient during that time. They feel like they're superwoman version of themselves. And then at ovulation, things really change. So there is a massive hormone shift that happens at ovulation that coincides with releasing the egg, and hormone levels rise. Now, they're supposed to be up there, and they're supposed to be high. And there are a lot of positive things that happen when hormone levels rise. But for women who are prone to PMS or who are suffering with PMS, that change in their hormones, right, from medium low to very high, and really it happens kind of overnight, puts a lot of pressure on her brain and on her mood that starts to show up in the way that she experiences the world. So there are physical symptoms that are associated with that hormone shift. So typically it's like bloating, breast tenderness. Women may have more headaches. They may feel puffy, right? There's lots of physical symptoms that go along with it. But the mental emotional symptoms that go along with that hormone change actually changes the way that women feel. It changes the way she sees the world. It changes the way that she has ability or inability to cope with stress or distress. It changes the way that she even perceives communication from other people. And this is a real phenomenon, right? Like this is an actual physiological thing that's happening in her brain. The way her brain is responding to those hormones is real. And so that's what's actually happening during that time. And now that I've explained all of that, I actually forget what your original question was.
That's okay. Because I actually, as I'm listening, and I'll go back because I have it written down, because my brain needs to write things down. But as I'm listening to you, I'm finding myself wondering, Jordan, like, do you think that it's 2021? Do you think we understand this? Because we talk about this all the time. We hear about, oh, women are so moody on their periods, or it's PMS. She's going to be such a bitch. She's going to, all the, like, we hear all of these things. But do you think that, and I would be curious, what happens with your population? Like, do you think women have a real understanding, like compassionate understanding for this reality? This is actually based in evidence. Like, we can see evidence that there is a marked shift in terms of how we see the world, how we see ourselves, and our ability to actually access those skills that allow us to regulate.
I don't think that women know. And that's been a huge part of my work. And I think when I'm working with women in a one-on-one fashion, a huge amount of what we accomplish in that first interaction together is normalizing her experience. And I don't mean normalizing it like meaning that we ignore it. I mean that acknowledging and validating, that's the better word, validating that her experience is a real experience and what is happening to her is actually a thing and it's not her. It's not just about her, right? It's not. And so that's like really important that I don't think we have that conversation enough. Do we know why it's happening? I'll say that in general in women's health, we have understudied women for all time, right? Women have been excluded from research trials for the sheer fact that they do menstruate, and they never in studies wanted hormones and hormone fluctuation to interfere with their findings, right? And this is why women are excluded from studies on medications. This is why women have been excluded from research in general, is that we don't want the interference of the menstrual cycle to cloud our understanding of the results. And so we've been studying this for a long time. There's like texts from hundreds and hundreds of years ago, them trying to understand PMS. They thought at one time it was so that if women didn't fall pregnant at ovulation, they got angry to then drive away their infertile partner to find a new one, right? Like we've had all of these theories for why this happens in our brain. We sort of understand some of the physiology behind it. We sort of understand some of the triggers, but I will say in general, we've understudied women, period, right? Right now, our sort of current understanding of the why PMS happens and why this is so relevant to like the modern woman is the impact that stress has on the likelihood of having PMS in the first place, and then also the severity. And when I say stress, like that can mean anything, right? But we also know that specific stressors, that, significant stressors or trauma, that specific traumas, right? Even if we were sort of to try and, segregate out the types of experiences women may have in their life, whether it's sexual abuse or physical abuse, all of these things actually increase her risk of experiencing PMS. And that's kind of where we're at in this understanding, is that this normal biological process that happens every month, the pressure of her life and her experiences and her nervous system combined with that subtle hormone change mid-month is actually, say, it's like gasoline on the fire in her brain as far as the ability to regulate her mood. And her brain is actually changed over time by those stressors, so that then when the hormones enter the scene, she's less capable of being able to feel herself in those situations and in that circumstance.
That is so fascinating, right? Just to like to even begin to probably put words and language to an experience that I imagine many, many women have been living. Really, right?
Yeah,
And
like we
really
think
not
like
understanding.
over 80% of women at some point in their life will have some experience of premenstrual syndrome. And the other part that's so fascinating is that if women have any, and I'm saying any, underlying mental health challenges, whether that's depression or anxiety, ADHD, OCD, any underlying mental health challenges are exacerbated with PMS. And so not only is it this standalone sort of mental health crisis for women, 14 days a month, but if you already have some tendencies or a full-blown diagnosis of other mental health, that it is, again, I always use that term gasoline on the fire because I think it's a really good analogy, that ovulation is gasoline on your OCD. It's gasoline on your ADHD. So women have this exacerbation of their experience of their low-grade anxiety that maybe they feel all month long, but now they really struggle to self-regulate and really struggle to even put into practice some of the things that we're hoping that they can do to support themselves.
I'm so glad that you're talking about this, because and I'm sure you see it in your practice. I've certainly seen it in my years of practice, but how many times have we sat across from a woman who feels like there is something wrong with her, that she is completely um inadequate, that there's like, right, like there's truly something wrong with me because I just can't seem to keep it together. I just can't seem to keep my cool. I just can't seem to keep my calm. And no matter how hard I try, I just feel completely flooded with emotion, or I feel completely out of control. And the impact that that has on a woman's self-esteem.
It's huge, right? It's huge. And, and even when we'll get into some of the simple things that women can do, like one of the challenges that we have, and not to make it all feminist, but we feel like we should show up the same way every single day in our patriarchal society, right? Like 9 to 5, plow it out. Every day's the same, hit your metrics, get your gold stars. And yet that isn't actually how female physiology works,
Can you
right?
say more
Like,
about that? Because I think that
yeah.
is such an important piece for us to understand. And I don't hear, a lot of people in many different industries, many different spaces talking about that. And I think it goes back to, for so long, the conversation hasn't included women and our hormones and our needs and just the ways that we are wired.
Right. And really women and again, not to like go all feminist, but I will. We have been taught, especially like my generation of women, right? It was like, you can have it all, right? You can go to school, show up in this scientific man's world. You can have any job that any of your male colleagues have, and you can do it just as well as them, if not better. Right. And so this idea that women need to, like he's used the word like show up, right? And to us, the way we've defined show up is be on every minute of the day, right? Be like consistent in our output, to hit metrics no matter what. But there is a remarkable difference for how productive we can be, how creative we can be, how talkative we can be at various times of our cycle. Kate Northrup does a really great job in her book. It's a very accessible resource for women to start to think about the way that those different phases of the cycle actually should be. We should have less meetings during PMS. And that's not because we're going to strangle our colleagues. It's literally because we actually do different work well during that time than being in a big crowded room with like, new ideas and brainstorming. That's not actually where we should be. We should be working from home, hammering out tasks, right? But we haven't designed our workday like that, and we haven't created those expectations for ourselves like that. I use my Instagram feed as a really good example. You can tell when I'm in my luteal phase.
Can you?
Yep, based on how much I recycle old content. So when I'm in my follicular phase, I'm like, new, I'm going to take over the world. Here's all of the things that I want to share with all women everywhere. And in my luteal phase, I'm like, here's a post I made 3 months ago.
Love that.
But it's honoring, right? And so the opposite of that is me waking up in my luteal phase going, shit, I got to put something on Instagram. Yeah. Oh God, I don't feel like it. I'm not creative. I don't know anything. Nobody cares what I have to say, right? And those thoughts are automatic at that time. And I know we've all had them. Like, none of my friends texted me today. They probably hate me.
Right. That's right. Right.
I got a sideways glance about making the kids lunches. Like, my husband probably thinks I do nothing all day. And right. Like, we've all done that. Yes. And it shows up in our work too. Right. But if we can see it coming, and if we can acknowledge it, and even if we have the luxury of building our lives around it a little bit, we can honor that ebb and flow in a way that's way more productive in the long run.
Can we talk about that? I think that's so interesting. And I know you and I touched on, going there in our conversation, but this idea that there truly is a different way that we can ebb and flow in our lives, right? And I love that you've brought this conversation to that place of leadership, right? And how do we as women, how do we lead differently, right, than men? And can we make space for that? And can we begin to have that conversation? And can we begin to give women the resources that will allow us to show up the way that we've been designed to show up?
Yes. So I think, when I start to think about like female leadership, I always think about how much it needs to start with each individual woman first. So the research on the impact of self-compassion on the way women experience their hormones is really profound. And interestingly, and this dates way back, so even like religious views on menstruation changed how women experienced their PMS. So if your religion growing up said menstruation is bad, menstruation is dirty, women are lesser during this time, women had more PMS symptoms.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas there are some religions that were relatively menstrual neutral, or even some that were very pro,
Mm-hmm.
right? That just historically, those women had less PMS, right? It was seen as less negative. It was seen as less, it was part of their life and their experience as women, and therefore they had less symptoms. And we actually see that now. So there was a cute study that was done where they texted women prompts about their cycle the week before their menstrual cycle. And so half of the women got prompts that were really positive, like, here comes your cycle. It's a vital sign into your health. Take care of yourself. You got it. You go, girl, right? They got all these
Mm-hmm.
texts. And then the other half got texts that were like, here it comes. Here comes the
Mm-hmm.
curse. This is the worst week of the month. And then they watched these women over months to see what their experience were. And the women who got the positive texts, they had a reduction in their PMS. And the women who had the negative text self-reported that their PMS got worse over time.
Right.
And so there is this remarkable influence on the language we use to describe our cycle, the compassion we have for ourselves during those times. And I think that's where feminine leadership needs to start, because if you can acknowledge those things in yourself, if you can have self-compassion around those pieces, that my output can't look like foot on the gas, 120 kilometers an hour every day, you start to lead in that way as well. You start to notice the ebb and flow in the women around you. You start to shift not your expectations, but the way that you communicate with your team in a way that is actually much more productive. I have a completely like all women team at work,
Mm-hmm.
and it's so beautiful to watch them, because now we're all in this together.
Mm-hmm.
The momming, all the things that we do together essentially, to watch each other support each other during various times of each other's cycle is such a beautiful thing, right?
Right.
But I do think it starts with that self-compassion, because if you have it for yourself, you are so much more likely to be able to see why your colleague needed an extra hour with a task, or why someone may not be able to perform, creatively, or they need some space or whatever. And we can actually build our team and our expectations of each other, recognizing that we're not going to have our foot on the gas all the time.
I love that. I love that. And I think you're right that, without having that compassion for ourselves in that space and really giving ourselves the room to lead differently, to show up differently, I do think it becomes pretty much impossible to be able to extend that to another person, right? It's that whole idea that when we start with self compassion, then we're able to extend compassion to others. But, I think for me, what really stands out is that, in the leadership space in particular, there's so much room for us to bring these pieces in, right? Like there's a whole area, I would say, of leadership that really hasn't been explored and that hasn't, right? Like we just really haven't given voice to this particular element of leadership and how it really affects us. Right. And I'm even learning, like, I'm learning so much just from talking to you about this, Jordan, because you know, how often do I pause in my own schedule and really think, okay, where is my capacity today? Right? Where am I best utilized today? And how am I best utilized today? Right? And do I even have the information and the insight to begin to make those decisions for myself? And I love that, right? I love that you are bringing that to the leadership conversation for women, right? I love that you're bringing that to the table because it truly is, it's an area that I'm hearing more and more about. Um, but I often am someone who's involved in conversations like this just because of the colleagues that I have in my life and the amazing women that I've been surrounded with. But I do wonder, like you talk about bringing this information to the everyday woman, right? Bringing this conversation to the everyday table. Is that happening? And I would probably agree with you and say no, it's really not happening enough. And we need to do it. We need to do it more. We need to have more and more of these conversations.
Yeah. And I think making those shifts, like it's not easy, right? To make those shifts. But if you can start to see, and again, when we get to talk into like what are some of the strategies that women can do, some of it is literally just that tracking reflection side of things, right? And when women have tracked their cycle in a way that lets them be in tune with, and I always say that I want to work at home by myself with a cup of coffee and not talk to anybody in my luteal phase, but maybe that's somebody else's luteal phase looks differently than that, right? Maybe
Mm-hmm.
your needs are different. But when we start to see what those pieces are and stop judging them so much, to say like, why am I going to bed at 8:30? Why do I snooze during these 3 days of the month? Why am I so hungry?
Mm-hmm.
Why is exercise not even on my radar during
Mm-hmm.
this time? If we can look at that a little bit more like a science experiment and less like this shameful, judgy, I must not be able to do it. I must be a complete total failure, which is how women do feel when they get off track a few days of the month. If you can kind of hold it out at 6 feet in front of you and say, like, what is going on here? And link it up with where you are in your cycle, you can see how you would make those shifts over time, right? And you can see how, from a work perspective, not that we want to be a slave to our cycle, but you could honor it, right? If we stopped rushing through things, meaning that like, how many times is like you give people assignments and you hope that they finish them by the end of the day, right? Like maybe that's just a practice that we need to stop. We need to
Right.
see that what needs to be done a little farther in advance so that we can fit it in at a time that like actually makes sense for us, right? From our
Right.
physiology perspective. But when we're racing against the clock all the time, we don't really have that ability to be compassionate because you feel like you're on a massive deadline all the time.
Yeah, I love this. And I'd love to shift gears and go there and really, because as I'm listening, I'm like, give me some quick wins, Jordan. What are some ways, like how can we as women and women who are really interested, I think, in not showing up at 100% every day, but showing up well and really redefining what that looks like? What are some, quick, accessible ways that we can begin to build some of this into our lives? How can we begin to implement some of these strategies in a way that'll give us some movement?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So the first and foremost is absolutely tracking. And if you follow me on Instagram, you know that I talk about this like every 3 days. But tracking your cycle is actually such a valuable piece of information for women. And even if you don't have a cycle, if you have an IUD, if there's something that gets in the way of you recognizing what day one is, I still recommend that you track. So my perimenopausal women will say, well, what am I supposed to do? Right? My cycle's like 70 days long. I say track anyways, right? Because what we're looking for is patterns. What we're looking for is some cause and effect, right? And so, I mean, if something happens once, it's not a trend. However, when we start to see things show up repeatedly, it starts to help us be able to predict things. And women have typically always thought that the purpose of tracking their cycle was just to fall pregnant. But I would argue that this is actually one of the most important windows into our general health and well-being. I would rather you track that than anything else that you're tracking. So if you're tracking steps, you should be tracking your cycle. And you want to nail down like how you feel during that time. And part of why this is also important is that some women do suffer with more significant PMS, or I alluded to PMDD, which is the more, I'm going to call it in air quotes, this more psychiatric version of PMS. And you may require more support, right? You may require treatment. If you've documented that, it makes that conversation with your healthcare provider so much more productive, and you may actually receive the care and treatment that you need versus being prescribed something maybe that's exclusively for your mental health, right? Where we want to acknowledge the hormonal component to it. So the tracking gives you that sort of advocacy piece when you do start to have a conversation with a professional about it as well. But that tracking gives you the ability to start to predict. It also lets you start to see this ebb and flow, or the maybe cause and effect. Do behaviors influence how you feel? So Women can tolerate alcohol in their brain better in their follicular phase than in their luteal phase.
Hmm.
And so women may have more rebound anxiety the day after a glass of wine in their PMS window than they do in their follicular phase. Right. And so just that sheer fact that you're tracking those like behaviors and then how you feel about them gives you some control and lets you stop feeling like you are being victimized by your cycle.
Right.
So that's really important. That's like number one. And I would track everything. I would track, how you feel in your body, if your clothes feel tight, how your mood is, if you're hungry, if you have cravings, if you have difficulty sleeping. I would track headaches. I would track everything.
Is there a device that you recommend, Jordan, or how do you recommend
How do
women
I do it?
track? Yeah.
Yeah, there are some great apps out there. I like Clue. It's a paid app. There's an app that is called Me V, like as in versus Me V PMDD, which actually
Mm-hmm.
uses the standardized rating scales for premenstrual disorder. So that I think is a valuable one. I use Clue, but even your Apple phone has a tracking app. I would say like some of the negatives around tracking apps is they like to make sort of predictions about fertility that are not particularly accurate. But if you're using it just to track your symptoms, then that can be valuable. But Clue actually will give you a little chart. And it once sent me a text saying like, you might be sad today. And then made me think of those studies. And I'm like, no, don't tell me that. You're going to.
Right. Yeah.
So those are good strategies, but even good pen and paper is not bad, right? Especially
Okay.
if you know where you're at in your cycle, you can just say, okay, after day 14, here's some of the things that I'm noticing about myself.
Okay. Perfect. Love that.
And then to start to move forward from that, your next step would to be to start to look at the self-care side of the way you're building your life and your schedule, because we know that stress is what's having that big impact on PMS. We know that women are stressed. And it's funny, like we've almost normalized it to the point of like that, well, there's nothing we can do about it. Right? Like women are under
Right.
immense pressure. They are homeschooling their kids, if we're in the year of the pandemic, right? All of
Yes.
those things, like there's an immense pressure on women. And we kind of go, yeah, women are really stressed.
Right. As if this is just the norm. We should accept it. There's nothing we can do about it.
Right. And I want women to feel like they have some power and control over that. And the
Mhm.
steps they need to take at the beginning are very small, right? It's the 5 minutes of meditation. It's the gratitude practice. It's the going to bed early and getting some catch-up sleep. It's the not dieting all the time, right? These are very basic self-care strategies that can get you out of that fight or flight. But they're the stepping stones that you need to take, right? Like as you hear me talking and you're going, God, like I work on a team of all men and I need to quit my job. Like, no, that's not the first step.
Right. Right.
The first step is that you need to meditate and go to bed early.
Yes.
And that's where we can start to get traction in your health so that you feel well enough all month to write your resume or do whatever it is you need to do to take those big leaps. But if women don't feel well 50% of the time, they're never going to be well enough to leave the toxic situation that they're in, whatever it is. And so those self-care strategies need to be relatively simple at the beginning. And so high compassion and a high emphasis on decreasing the strain that your nervous system is under.
And I appreciate, and I've always noticed that about your work, I appreciate the attention that you give to implementing and adopting small skills and just gaining traction with those over time, right? So it's not this big, massive change that needs to happen where you're, taking away everything that you enjoy and implementing all these things that you totally don't want to implement, but that there really are small acts of self-compassion and self-care that over time really do gain that traction.
Yeah, the hardest things to teach patients is like traction building and pacing. Right.
Mm-hmm.
And you can imagine and women are notorious for this. They feel a little bit better, right? Or they flip into their follicular phase after a week of really not feeling like themselves. And they're like, well, thank God, because I got a lot of shit to do.
Mm-hmm.
Right. Like you wake
Right.
up that one morning and you're like, okay, I feel myself. Bring it on. Let's do the laundry. Let's do the stuff. Let's do the, and then they do all the things.
Right.
And then they slide into that luteal phase as a depleted version of themselves because they were trying
Right.
to maximize time while they felt well.
Mm-hmm.
When that's the pacing piece that we don't do that well. And that never builds traction. You can't lead your day recovering from yesterday. You need to eat and sleep today to prep for tomorrow.
Yes.
That's how we actually get somewhere. Because if we're in that perpetual recovery, again, you'll never feel well enough to quit your job. So you need to like get ready for tomorrow today.
Right. And it sounds like there's like this intersection between pacing and traction building, right? They both sort of happen simultaneously.
Yes. And when women have that ebb and flow, right? If they wake up on day 4 and they feel like, I saw a great meme that like had Cinderella, like, and it was like, when I go into day 4 and my estrogen starts to rise and I feel confident and beautiful and all of those things, you need to go, okay, I still only need to operate at about 70% output here, or next PMS phase is going to be a real disaster.
Right. I love that. Beautiful. Okay. So tracking your cycle, making that space for that self-care, self-compassion, getting that traction and that pacing in.
Yeah. And then the last one is probably about communication. So we started the conversation talking about relationship distress, right? And I want to come back to that. We know that women don't perceive facial expressions the same way in their PMS window as they do in their follicular phase. So they literally showed women faces, and the women had to rate the faces and how mad those faces were or what they thought. It was just like, it was pretty open-ended. And the women in their luteal phase were more likely to rate the faces as mad. And they were also more likely to rate the faces as being mad at them. Right? They look like they're mad at me.
This was
right?
The most,
it wasn't just
we
they were
about
mad.
this, and I was like, this is so fascinating, Jordan. You need to share this with my audience.
Yeah. And so we literally those changes that are happening in the brain influence the way that you perceive your world and your environment, right? I get patients saying all the time, I want to divorce my partner, but like only 2 weeks of the month. Right. And so we don't know why specifically like that happens. We don't, again, they think there's some evolutionary advantage to having PMS, apparently. But there's definitely that discomfort and challenge with communication during that time, because your perception of it is different. Your reality is altered by that hormone experience. And so tone of voice is perceived differently. Facial expressions are perceived differently. And that like withdrawn side of yourself, right, that is happening during PMS, which if we leveraged is your work from home day on the couch, right? But when we try and push it into our normal day, we experience like conflict, right? There's more conflict. There's more interpersonal conflict in women who have PMS, because during that time, they're not as capable of viewing reality as maybe this peaceful morning, right? You view the rush in the morning with your partner as having a ton of conflict.
Right. It's so fascinating, right? To finally be able to have some evidence for what, again, I think women have been experiencing and feeling for so long.
Yeah. And I think, and it goes both ways, right? Like, I think we blame women for being hormonal often when maybe we're just downright angry and we have a million things to be angry about, right? Like maybe, and that's why the tracking is helpful. And it doesn't mean that because you're angry in your luteal phase that you have nothing to be angry about. It's just that those emotions are more accessible, or your capacity and ability to resolve conflict is less accessible. So it actually takes us longer to resolve conflict in our luteal phase than in our follicular phase. It doesn't mean that there isn't stuff to be mad about, right? It doesn't mean that the crying is wrong. It's that it's easy, right? It's more accessible during that time.
It's like it's more at the surface, right? It's
Yes.
it's harder to access the skills that allow us to self-regulate during those times.
Yes.
And that's why I think it?
Totally. Yeah. And often when I post about tears or whatnot, and I try and do it in a humorous way on social media, I quite often will get the comments like, well, crying's not wrong. And it's like, well, I never said crying was wrong. It's that it's more accessible during that time. And for some women, it is so accessible during that time that they feel non-functional.
Right. And that's where we can have women reporting that I feel completely out of control, or I feel completely flooded. There's nothing I can do about it. I get totally stuck.
Yeah. And that warrants support, right? And it's different if you're a crier, right? And if you're someone that has those emotions or accesses those emotions really easily. But when it starts to interfere with your work or your relationships, or it just is not meeting your own expectations of how you want to show up in the world, you are welcome to receive support for it, right?
Jordan, yeah, that makes so much sense. And again, I think this is the piece that, as we chatted earlier, I was like, we've got to talk about this because I believe that this is the piece that women really need to hear. And again, going right back to kind of where we started, and a couple of words that you used is we really need to be acknowledging and validating this for women. We need to be
Mm-hmm.
acknowledging and validating these experiences and then providing women with the tools and the resources to be able to move through this in a way that's honoring to us.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I think that relationship piece, that a great step, I think, is for women that have been tracking, that are paying attention to how they feel in their body, is just to communicate that you don't feel yourself, right? Or
I
that
love
you're
it.
feeling that, because I think we know even in the research that like the male partner often responds to PMS with avoidance and withdrawal,
Mm,
right? And the female partner is already misinterpreting or interpreting, very emotionally those facial expressions. And so you can imagine like this is a little bit of a recipe for disaster, conflict, when if the natural tendency for the male partner is to avoid and withdraw, but the female partner is now perceiving all that avoidance and withdrawal with that lens of PMS, but to be able to name it, right? Because your partner wants you to feel well and feel yourself and to support you. If you can communicate to them what your experience is and what it's like for you in this time, it can help them help you,
yeah, and it,
right?
it goes back for me as I'm listening to you. I mean, I absolutely hear the parallels between what you're saying and what I often teach my community and talk to my community about, and also the connection between the three strategies that you've given, right? Like, in order for us to communicate openly and in order for us to be able to ask our partner for what we need to have that self-awareness. I always say that, right? Like one of the keys to assertive communication in our relationships is we need to have a really heightened sense of self-awareness and be able to identify for ourselves what it is that we need. We got to get really, really clear on that. And I love that the strategies that you've given us give us a framework to do that, right? Tracking our cycle, like having that information gives us that self awareness. It gives us that insight. Practicing that self care allows us to, put some pieces into place in our own lives so that we actually are able to have that difficult conversation because it's often not an easy conversation to have, even to simply say, I'm really struggling right now, right? Is I'm not feeling myself right now, or I'm feeling really tired right now, or I'm actually feeling really upset and I'm not sure why, right? But to be able to have a conversation like that requires that self-care. It requires that self-awareness and the courage to really be able to be honest.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And it's such a simple thing to explain. And it's hard, right? And you can feel like as a woman, you can feel like it's really difficult to communicate what that experience of PMS actually feels like to your partner. And I think that's maybe one of the challenges that my women will have is like, well, how do I even explain what this
Mm-hmm.
feels like, right?
Mm-hmm.
That like you wake up one morning and it is different, right? You
Right.
feel tired and not like yourself, and like it's difficult. That's difficult to communicate, right? Which goes along with all of the other challenges we have in discussing mental health, right? It's that invisible illness experience. You look fine, right?
Yeah.
But internally there's a chemical shift that's actually making you feel really unwell. But just being able to communicate that openly. My husband and I use humor. We that's our happy place, right? As
Yep.
if we're making each other laugh. And so I will send him a quick text to be like, dude, watch out. Like, this is a PMS day. And he'll respond like, try not to kill the kids before I get home. Right.
Right.
And
Right.
like, it brings that, like, that level of humor to it. But I'm also acknowledging like, this is not one of those nights where I can have a conversation that requires, you know, maybe anything.
Right, right. I love
But
that.
it's
I love
setting that
that.
stage, right? Like, this is not really an awesome night for me. I need your support, right? And what that
Yes.
looks like is like, I'm going to read in bed while you do bedtime. And that's not happening very often, but that's, I'm asking for it,
Yes.
maybe directly or indirectly, by
Yes.
just stating like, this is one of those days that I'm not really that okay.
Yeah.
And the humor actually helps, right?
Yeah.
Like for me, so for
Yes.
me to like hear those jokes of like, and be like, don't worry if you burned dinner, you're still pretty, right? Like I need
Right.
that. I need
Right.
I need the
Right.
jokes in order
Right.
to help pull me out of it. But I only got to that place by us having like really that I also would wanted him to leave a couple times per month.
Mm-hmm.
To get to that place of being like, oh, like this is not functional actually.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I love it. And I think you bring up a good point. I think, and my husband and I actually use a lot of humor in our communication, but for us, it's not passive aggressive humor. Like it is actually a very direct way for us
Mm-hmm,
to
mm-hmm.
communicate. And we only got here because we went through the years of not being able to communicate directly and openly and honestly about some really tough things. So I love that. I love that we can really get to that place where we can use humor as a way to talk about some things that may have actually been really heavy and really weighty at one point.
Mm-hmm. And I don't mean the kind of, and I think there's a lot of humor about, oh, you're hormonal, right? Is it your time of the month? That is not productive humor, in my opinion,
Right.
because that's one-sided, right? That's not like really acknowledging. And you like, there's plenty to be mad at half the month, and so maybe you were being a complete jerk and you deserved it, right? But it's that like humor that we can have together. That's like, I'm acknowledging that I'm having a hard time, and he is reflecting back to me, okay, you are having a hard time, and I'm going to do my best to make you smile. Like, that's that like productive use of humor. But I don't want women to get into that position with their partners where we're joking about how moody they are, because that is not productive.
Right. Right. Yes. And I think that's a really important distinction to make. Jordan, I want to thank you so much for your time and your insight. And I know that as my audience is listening to you, they are going to want to come and stalk you on Instagram, just as I do. I totally stalk you on Instagram because I just think you put out the most
I love
amazing.
Instagram.
That's your space. I feel like you just shine and your personality comes through and the information is there. Can you please share with our audience how they can find you?
Sure. Yeah, I love Instagram, and all the good links are there. So I mean, like I said at the beginning, like my goal is really to help women like understand and learn about their health so that they can either become a self advocate or that they know how to access the good quality information that they need to actually move their health forward. I don't know if women can change the world when we feel debilitated half the month. And so I have this personal mission for us to be PMS free, or at least PMS, have the volume turned down at the very least, so that we can be those productive people in society that can actually make change. So Instagram is the best place to find all of those things. And my handle is at Dr. Jordan ND. So it's at Dr. Jordan ND. And that's where you can find links for all the things like my podcast, which is a women's health focused podcast called Women's Health Unplugged. That's where you can find links for my clinical practice, where I do treat women in Ontario virtually and in person. And it's where all the links are for our programs. So we offer a women's health program that actually walks women through a curriculum to help them understand their hormones, implement self-care and compassion and community, called the Wild Collective, where we take registrations in 3 times per year, and we are accepting our next semester in May. All of those links are off Instagram. So that is a wonderful place to start.
Thank you so much. I'm sure that my audience will just head on over there and connect with you. Any
There's
parting
a lot of
words?
memes.
There's a
There's a
lot of
lot of
memes.
memes.
Go for the memes.
I
They are
communicate through
amazing.
memes. This
Yes,
is the
you
best way. Yeah.
Any parting words, Jordan, as we wrap up today?
I mean, I've said a lot, and I think I hopefully have communicated just that validation piece to women. That's really what I want you to come away from this conversation with, that this is a real thing that's happening in your brain that is affecting the way that you feel. And so one, like that, there are things that you can do to help support yourself, but also that this is something absolutely worth being treated and being supported, because how amazing would it be if you didn't have those days, right? Or if they, like I said, we turned the volume down on those days. So I want women to know that there are solutions and that it is worthy of seeking solutions, right? This is not the welcome to womanhood kind of experience. I don't accept that in medicine. I think we need to shoot for better. And the more women that come to understand and know about their hormones, the less we'll start to tolerate putting up with not feeling well.
Amazing. Dr. Jordan Robertson, thank you so much.